started working for it. Remember.
And
I'm still doing this.
Good. Well, good evening, everyone. I would like to call this meeting of the Legislative Committee to order. It's been a while since we've been here, so it's very good to be back. I do want to do what we've done before, just for the audience and any new members, to go around the table and have everybody introduce yourself. So we'll start over here with Mr. Clemens.
Now I'm ready. Byron Clemens with AFT St. Louis. Thank you.
Jamie Major, Interim General Counsel.
Emily Kelso, Chair of the Parent Action Council for St. Louis Public Schools.
Angie Banks, Chief Financial Officer.
Calvin Adams, Superintendent, St. Louis Public Schools.
Matt Davis, Board of Education, Chair of this committee.
Steve Carroll, Legislative Consultant, Lobbyist for SLPS.
Lori Willis, Deputy Superintendent for Institutional Advancement for St. Louis Public Schools.
Isaac Pollock, Associate Superintendent of School Innovation, Turnaround and Charter Partnerships.
Good evening, everyone. Nicole Williams. I serve as Chief of Staff here in the St. Louis Public Schools.
Good evening, Charles Burton, Chief Human Resource Officer for St. Louis Public Schools.
Janet Tilley with Missouri School Boards Association.
And Dr. Patrick Charles of AFT and Sumner High School is sitting over in the back. You could pull up a chair next to Byron if you want to, or if you don't want to. Well, thank you all. So we do have two very special guests. First of all, Janet Tilley of the Missouri School Boards Association is here, and she has brought along Linda Quinley of the Missouri School Boards Association. Linda is here to give us a presentation on work that she has done in the Kansas City Public Schools and to talk a little bit about efficiency studies in school districts. So Ms. Quinley, I'm going to start with you if you want to talk a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into your presentation. And then the way this committee works is we always try to make it a discussion as much as possible.
Perfect. I love that. Thank you, Mr. Davis. It's great to be here. I have had the opportunity to interact over the last 5 years with Dr. Adams and Angie, and that's always been a great experience. And of course, know Steve Carroll. So it's nice to get to meet more of you. A little bit about me. I did just retire, although my husband has told me quit saying that because I went to work for Missouri School Boards Association. But I just retired from Kansas City Public Schools, where I spent 5 years as Chief of Finance and Operations. And prior to that, spent 11 years in Columbia Public Schools in the same role. So two really different experiences. What I have loved to add to that is that when I worked for Columbia Public Schools, I do know their name. I lived about 30 miles outside of Columbia in a small town called Fayette. If you've heard of Central Methodist University, that's kind of the only thing I can tell you that there is in Fayette. Small town where my kids graduated from high school with about 45 students in their senior class. So I have a real passion for all different types of public education in Missouri, and was really tickled and excited when Melissa said there's this opportunity for us to work together on developing a new school finance program at Missouri School Boards Association. And so I'm excited to be with you tonight. I love the conversational kind of component. So please feel free to say, let's talk more about that. That doesn't make sense. Or Linda, you just said something that was really crazy, and we'll stop and chat. Your mic system is going to be complex for me. So if I do that wrong, just wave at me and I'll know I need to look down at my mic. And if you're ready, we'll just dive right in. How's that? So just a little background. I arrived July of 17 at Kansas City Public Schools, and I did need to learn this charter piece around funding because it is certainly very different than what I had experienced in Columbia or when I was a parent and an advocate in the small communities school in Fayette. So I started creating a study to help me understand what are the implications and the rules and all of those things around school finance in a charter community. Because as we all know here, there is not any kind of comprehensive data available at the state level for Kansas City or St. Louis around that. So we took that lead and started adding, many of you have heard about the systems analysis. Dr. Adams referenced that because Dr. Bedell, my superintendent in Kansas City, has shared historically with some groups. But looking at student achievement, mobility, those things related to the outcomes of our investments we're making with our money, and really trying to lay those two side by side. So that data piece adds a ton of value to what you're going to see tonight. But we also wanted to create opportunities for local collaboration with our charters and working for what was in the best interest of all students in our community. And then we really started a lot of conversation around the state. May I lay those there so that I don't do that again? Okay. And I've got, this says disclaimers, it's probably the wrong title, but just a few pieces of information. Most of what you're going to see tonight is financial data extracted from DESE. All of it came from DESE. I didn't make any of it up. Largely from the ASBR, which is called the Annual Secretary of the Board Report. Really, that's a confusing title because it's the financial report. I doubt the Secretary of the Board ever touches it here. Angie's team most likely does that. Some things that make it a little different. For example, charter schools report on a cash basis where we are accrual. We're accrual at Kansas City. So that changes things a little bit. Coding things happen. There are just some things that make this data not perfect, but it is the data that is available. So some background in Kansas City and why this became so important when it did. You see here this enrollment grid. The blue line being KCPS and the gold line being charters, and then the gray line that ends up being on top being the total count. So collectively, from 1999 to 2021, in the Kansas City system, you'll hear me say that a lot tonight. That is, when I say that, I mean the district plus charter schools. In the Kansas City system, there was a decline from 35,000 to 26,000 students total. So families were leaving the community and going a lot of times to just the surrounding districts, but all over. And you can see that decline in the public school enrollment with the growth of charter school enrollment. That was driving a lot of need for understanding where we were and what was going on. So when we put this together initially, and I should just say, when I left Kansas City Public Schools, I shared with Dr. Bedell sort of what my journey was going to be with Missouri School Boards Association. And one of the things that our executive director and I were mutually passionate about, and now I have the luxury of working with Janet Tilley again, who's also passionate about this, is coming from a third party perspective at some of this view instead of district driven perspective. And so they said, yes, please take this project with you. And so a lot of what you've seen really does drive from that work that initiated there at KCPS. So when you're looking at the Kansas City system with just under 27,000 students in school year 19, you see the number of school options there. So if we add those up, 44 and 21 is 65, 80 school options in the Kansas City system. So that's basically building options because of the size, including charter schools. We compared ourselves to Springfield, the largest district in the state of Missouri, who has a similar enrollment in total to what we have in the Kansas City system. And you see 45, 50 options compared to 80. So I want to sit on that for just a second, because we know that's going to mean something, right? That's going to mean inefficiencies in our system compared to a Springfield system, because bricks and mortar cost money. The staff to be in bricks and mortar cost money, the utilities, all of those things. So we're going to look at a little bit of those pieces, but that is an important fact behind this data. So let's look at just high schools. When we look at that comparison, you see over 7,000 students in the Springfield High School, and in the Kansas City system, over 6,000. So less kids in total. On average in a building in Springfield, almost 1,500. On average in a building in Kansas City, 408. And I know you guys have been doing a lot of work around this yourselves in recent years. You've had a lot of hard conversations. You've got a lot of hard work ahead related to this very thing. But when you have 15 high school buildings with 400 kids on average, what does that mean for those students typically? Fewer options, absolutely. When you're staffing those small schools, you tend to not be able to staff up for French and for advanced this and for these electives, because you can afford to staff for those basic, English, math, those things that we are obligated to give our children, but it takes away opportunities for kids when they sit in these small schools. And so I think that's really important. And it's one of the real kudos to you for taking on some of the hard work around these very conversations. All right, so now the fun stuff. We're going to get into some numbers and some money. And again, please, if I'm using acronyms or confusing you with my terminology, raise your hands, or if you just want to talk more about it. I tried to keep this to 30 slides so that I could get through it in less than an hour, but happy to stop wherever you want me to. So this slide right here, I'm going to take just a second on it because I think it's really important. I think they're all important, so I'm going to quit saying that. But a 10-year look, and in that first column, 11-12, what you can see is that KCPS received about $18 million in a year, or an average of $1.5 million a month from the state in state aid payments. As charter enrollment increased and district enrollment decreased, one of the things that happens before you get equal there is, for us, and I imagine for you guys too, Angie can confirm, the local aid is more per pupil than state aid. And so before you become equal enrollment, you hit a point where the state has kept all of your state revenue in order to pass local to your students. And so some of you may not know that's how it works, but the way the charter schools get their local aid is every month they take it out of St. Louis and Kansas City state aid payment. And then they pass it on to the charter schools. And that's really important from a lot of operational standpoints. But we hit that point in 1920 where no longer were we getting any state aid. And you can see it had gotten down to about $200,000 a month. If you take your total annual budget and divide it by 12, that's pretty close to how much cash flow you need every month. It's not exact because some months are higher and some months are lower, but it's a good number. So basically what this slide shows us is year after year, we were becoming more reliant in Kansas City on good fund balances as of June 30th. Because we weren't getting those monthly payments from state aid that other schools around the district are. And on the reverse side of that, charters were getting their local tax revenue every single month because it was being withheld from us. And so I like to say, being a girl from a small town and a farm girl, public schools are really like farmers. We sell our crop in January, which means our patrons paid their taxes. Right? And we need to live on that revenue until next January, just like our farmers need to live on that crop November to November when they're harvesting. And so it causes a lot of issues around how we manage in the charter environment so very differently than our peers around the state. Does that make sense? It was a lot, I know. Help me out, Angie, when I get off, okay? So what does this tell us? We know that charter growth has been consistent. It's reduced that amount of money coming to us in total. But that loss of monthly state aid drives up our need for a high fund balance June 30th. So it's not uncommon for us to be criticized at the amount of cash we're sitting on in the bank June 30th. It looks like a big number. Well, it is a big number compared to my checking account, right? I don't know how it compares to yours, but it's a lot of money, and we can be honest about that. But it's a lot of money because we're not getting that monthly influx that other districts around the state are, or the charters are. And so therefore we have to sit on this really high amount of cash June 30th in order to make it to next January, because we're basically paying our bills out of the savings account. We're not replenishing that savings account with those monthly influxes from the state. So I think that chart is really important to help us really resonate and think about that component. And we're going to look a little more at fund balance in a little bit. So expenditure per pupil, before we get into some of the things I really want to talk about, I'm just giving you a little bit of background data that I find so interesting. That first column, KCPS, and that second column, KCPS change over time, I want to make sure it's really clear what that says. So in 9-10, we were spending $15,640 per pupil. In 12-13, we were spending $13,399. That column next to it, the 2,241, that's the cumulative change from 9-10. So 15,640 less 13,339, 399 is 2241. I just want to make sure that second column you don't look at as an annual change. That's the cumulative change over time. But I like to show it like that to get you all the way down to 18-19, because those next 2 years are artificially buoyed by SRN CARES dollars. So they become a little harder to compare. But when you look at 18-19, what that first column says is that in KC public schools, we were spending $303 less per pupil than we were 10 years prior. Charter schools were spending $3,285 more per pupil than they were prior on average. And that is about how the revenues had shifted and where the revenues were going. So I think that's really important. And back to our earlier conversation about options, this is what was happening in a system where there weren't robust options for children. One of the things that Kansas City's really been working hard the last few years, and part of their Blueprint 2030, if you have the opportunity to watch any of that Dr. Bedell initiated, is really looking at how do we put robust opportunities back in the system for our children. And this is without it. And so we're spending less. So therefore, even harder and harder to add improvements for what our kids needed and had access to. I think really important to note, we'll acknowledge, I want to stay on that 18-19 year because things do go kind of crazy when the ESSER dollars start flowing. But the Kansas City system was spending about $1,200 more per year per pupil than our charter counterparts. But what we know is that who we serve is dramatically different. The demographics of those two populations are different. There's a lot of federal aid that comes in behind certain demographics. And so therefore there are some higher resources for KCPS, and it's always evidenced in these numbers. And we're going to see that over and over tonight as we look at these. But really, really important that there should be a difference there, because there is a difference in who we're serving. So I'm going to hit Board of Ed. We have some Board of Ed members here tonight as we get started, but just kind of the key theme: multiple schools competing for the same pool of students will result in inefficiency and fewer options for children. That I have proven to myself numerically over these 5 years I've been studying this, and I don't think that that can really be denied. But this layout here, we're going to kind of walk through multiple departments and funding lines. So I want to make sure this makes sense. So please do stop me here if it doesn't. So in the study, I'm looking at 2014-15 and then 2021. That 21-22 data is starting to become available, but not all those ASBRs are in yet, and it will take some time to digest those. So it's about a year old. But at Kansas City Public Schools, this is what that top line means. For the Board of Education expense, as denoted in the DESI accounting manual, which is a really good manual if people follow it and study it, Kansas City Public Schools spent $250,000 that year for Board of Ed costs as defined by DESI. The charter schools spent $715,000. There are 19-ish of those boards. In 2021, Kansas City spent $470, probably was an election year. They have an offset, a year where there are no board members on the ballot. Charter schools had doubled their amount from 700,000 to 1.4 million. Collectively, the Kansas City system, KCPS plus the charter schools, were spending 964,000 in 14-15, and that doubled to 1.8 million in 2021 at $68 per pupil. Springfield, our comparison district, because they're similar in size, although not identical, certainly in demographic, spent 574,000 and 500,000. 67% less than in that Kansas City system because we have 20 school boards instead of one school board. So one of the reasons that I like to look at this is I like in this dive into this data to look at where we're spending money administratively and operationally that is keeping us from investing directly into kids as a system, right? As a system. So $1.3 million more being spent in the Kansas City system just for Board of Education expense. So that's one of the key lines that I wanted to look at. So let's take that very same look at executive administration costs. We'll go straight to the system. Kansas City system, 15.9 million in 14-15, up to 34 million. I've got a little bit disclaimer over here. This is one of the areas where some DESI coding changed and some more things dumped into that line. So it isn't necessarily a 100% increase, but definitely an increase. But the key factor, $1,280 per pupil being spent in executive costs. And you see down below here, kind of those things it includes. It includes your executive staff and expenses, community relations, labor negotiations, administrative technology services. So a lot of things. Compare that to Springfield, 13.7 million or $608 per pupil, 100% more than Springfield is spending. And that's because all 19 charter schools and the Kansas City Public Schools has to have a superintendent. They have to have a CFO. They have to have people doing these jobs. They're just spread out among 20 systems rather than being in a single system like Springfield. Yes, Steve.
Linda, I think the ASBR pointed that out when we used that in our committee hearing this year, that, the inefficiencies in charters because of their overhead cost is much greater than the St. Louis Public Schools, which really counters the argument that the charter saying we want to give more choices, but yet you're really getting fewer choices because of the overhead cost, at least in my perspective.
Well, and I think if we look at this one right here, the amount per pupil in the Kansas City charters is $1,328 compared to $1,231 in the Kansas City system. And so on average, they are spending more in these areas than the largest part of the system, which is the public school system. So you're spot on. Yes, sir.
Is transportation in this?
No, we'll get to that. It is not transportation. This is really some parts of central office, but not all of central office. Okay.
And it's special education part of this?
It is not. And we'll look at that one too. Great questions, because those are some high costers, right? And some critical components of service for our kids. So when we look at this one where we're 110% more, that's $20.6 million of additional executive cost. $20 million in St. Louis going toward executive costs as compared to Springfield, because we're running 20 businesses instead of one. So just kind of simplify that concept. So another department, we'll pick on Angie's division, although these are not her numbers, business and finance. The Kansas City system spending $10.3 million in 2021 or $383 compared to Springfield's $194. Again, 100% more. And again, Steve, Kansas City Charter is spending more per pupil than the public school system is. So another $5.9 million going toward administrative kind of components versus instruction for students because we're running 20 businesses instead of one business. So just a really important piece. So collectively now we're at $27.8 million. Now I want to pause on this slide and talk about what these numbers might tell us. This isn't just about, this is not, charters are a bad thing and charters are expensive, but let's be honest, choice costs money, right? Choice is expensive. Your community, the community in Kansas City has decided they want choice. That's great, right? Choice is an option, but choice is expensive because you've got to pay for all of these costs. But I want to think about what does it just tell us if we want to use this data in this study and just reflect on ourselves. So if we just compare Kansas City to Springfield, KCPS, and KCPS is about half the size of Springfield Public Schools on its own. So KCPS on its own is spending 70–80% more in this area than Springfield is. And Springfield's supporting twice as many children. So it helped us start thinking about, and I know these have driven some of the conversations you've had, have we kept up at central office with appropriate staffing levels and compensation levels as that enrollment piece was doing this? Or have we stayed comfortable in our environment with, we need all these people because we did when we were a 35,000 student system? And so it can help you challenge yourself, this data can, around not just let's talk about the system, but how can we use it internally to make sure that we're challenging ourselves to be best? Is it about number of people? Is it about how much each person costs? Is it about extra services that this department uses that are external in nature and that may or may not be expensive? So as you track this historical data, there's a great way to use it internally and externally is really my message to you. The way this file is put together, I have from 2014-15, as you see, through 2021, by every line on the ASBR, which is a lot of them. So I look by function and by object. This historical data for each individual charter school and Kansas City Public Schools and Springfield. So it really lets us hone in and identify our own inefficiencies and talk about if Springfield is spending $100 here per pupil and we're spending $300 and we see their performance here and ours here, what might we learn from them, right? What might we reconsider so that we're making sure we're putting resources in the right place and that we're using them at the highest possible level. So there is great internal use for this. We've used this data a lot externally to talk about Missouri's interest in growth and expansion in charter schools and what things they might want to consider. But there is also a great internal use for this data. And because that's my world, I like to talk about it. So this is an additional 5.9 million above what Springfield is spending. So now we're up to $27.8 million on executive and administrative type costs beyond what Springfield is spending in the system, not just the school district, but in the system. So building administration, this is our principals, assistant principals, and those support staffs who help with them who are coded in that 2411. And here I've given you a little bit more information looking at some of those ratios that are available out there on DESE's website about the number of pupils per. So if we look at KCPS in 14-15, for every one administrator, there was 172 students. Now this one you're going to have to work on. So gear up, pay attention, because I'm going to stand quiet while you walk through this one. In 2021, that went to one administrator for every 159 students at $911 per pupil. The charters went from 169 students for every administrator to 125. Springfield from 272 to 215. Now that is post-COVID enrollment loss, right? We know that we were all kind of trying to figure out where kids were during 1920 and 2021. So that did distort ratios of adults as well as spend. But we're comparing apples and apples here. And so for this conversation, I think it's okay. So in the Kansas City system, almost $10 million more spent on building administration, which is almost 60 additional administrators. So just think about that why. And the why is we have lots more buildings. They all have to have school administrators. You can't have a building without a principal. Can't have a building without instructional leadership. But where in the next 5 years do we find 60 additional administrators when we can't staff the teachers we need today? And so this is there are staffing implications all throughout this. But let's unpack it. I'd like to know what you see, and then let's answer that question. What has happened at KCPS as enrollment has dropped in this area? We have not reduced the number of buildings, but that's an answer to our problem, isn't it? We have not reduced the number of buildings. Our student enrollment has declined, so therefore our ratio has gotten worse instead of better. We have less students per administrator because we've kept the same old. And again, that's a conversation KCPS has started. And I believe as early as next week might prepare a list of possible closures for next year to share with their community if they're still on the track from June. So yes, enrollment dropped, same number of buildings open, your efficiency is automatically decreasing, right? So what's happened at charter schools as their enrollment has increased? Their enrollment has increased, but their ratio has gotten worse, right? They're now serving 104 students with every administrator compared to 170. So the cause of that might be, what do you think? I'm not an educator, but I try to be one when I'm in an educator. So I try not to sit and get all night long with numbers. Is it about additional charters opening? Is it about expansion of charter schools? I was a K-6, now I'm going to be a K-8, so I'm going to have a middle that I add, or I'm going to expand into high school. Yes, it is. So more options in the charter environment has started to kind of eat its own as well, right? And their inefficiency has grown here. So when we compare us to Springfield, we're now up to a total of 37 million more that we're expending on these administrative functions. 37 million in the Kansas City system. And what I have known since I came into public ed, which was only 16 years ago, most of my career was in banking and insurance and public accounting, but I have never known a board, and you, sir, may disagree with me on this, but I have never known a board or a superintendent who didn't want to pay their teachers more. I just haven't seen it. It's awful hard in this environment to accomplish that goal. All right, so to the transportation question, here it is. Switching a little out of the administrative side over to some of the operational components. Then this was like crazy to actually visualize and witness for me. Multiple buses in the same neighborhood picking up kids because there might be 5 schools in the same neighborhood within the same 20 minutes of each other picking up children, right? We're passing each other in the streets. We can't get around each other. That is a lot. Buses are expensive. Buses are very expensive. Bus drivers are expensive and hard to come by. And so there's a lot of service component there. But in the Kansas City system, we're spending $1,120 per pupil, or almost $30 million to transport kids. And in Springfield, they're spending $10 million, a third, 1/3 the amount. So look in that little box over there, there's a lot of numbers and figures. Kansas City covers 67 square miles. Springfield covers 137 square miles. Yet we're spending 3 times as much in the Kansas City system because choice is expensive and transportation matters when it comes to choice. So 15% of the charters in Kansas City don't even provide transportation, or this number would be higher. This ratio would be more distorted. But really important to that, in the other factors at the bottom, that inefficiency matter, and I have heard Dr. Adams talk about this in testimony in Jefferson City so many times, I can't even count them. Because of how transportation is funded in Missouri, there's an automatic hit to us, to St. Louis, in the revenues that we recoup from this cost because of the inefficiency factor put into transportation. Intentionally, the state said, look, you can't just be driving all over town and us pay for it. You've got to be smart. You've got to be savvy and efficient about how you route and pick up children. Because the state's not just going to pick up everything. Not that they've been paying for anything lately, but this year, 75%, right? It's coming. Thank goodness. So that inefficiency factor, we're spending a lot more. That inefficiency factor reduces that reimbursement from the state that we can get. So it's a double whammy. We don't get the revenues that a more efficient system will get, and we have a cost that is way beyond those efficient systems. So this is an area where it has just broken my heart how much is going into busing kids to school instead of what they're getting while they're in school. Really important factor, I think. So Kansas City intentionally, and I don't know what you guys have done here, but right before I went there, so 6 years ago, they intentionally reduced that walk distance to compete with charter schools who are going door to door. Very smart move on our board's part, right? I think Jennifer Wolfsey was one of the people that said, look, smart business decision here, right? They did that knowing that in that year alone, that would increase the transportation budget by almost $4 million. But we can't lose kids to door-to-door pickup. That can't be the reason we lose kids. So sometimes you intentionally spend money in an area you wish you didn't have to because it's the business decision that you have to make. And so I totally respect that. So now we're up to $57 million in administrative and operating costs that we're spending more than Springfield is to educate their children. Facilities. Kind of alluded to this when we got started. So operation of plant is what you find it referred to in here. That includes your maintenance crews, your custodial crews, your grounds crews, vehicle maintenance. For a lot of charter schools, lease instead of own buildings. So those operating leases are coded here. And perhaps the school district has a couple of lease facilities as well. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at here. Kansas City system, $48.6 million in 2021, almost the same as 14-15. So that's not all bad, but it does mean something else. $1,800 per pupil on average. Notice that here KCPS is less efficient than charter schools. And that's about a variety of things, but again, goes to similarly to that conversation we had about central office. As the enrollment just kind of slowly declined, all of those schools stayed open. They did have some closures, but not enough to get to the actual enrollment and really address these inefficiencies. I see a question. Absolutely. Another great point. So, and particularly right there on the bottom, it includes the cost of outdated facilities, such as higher utilities, higher costs of repair and maintenance. You guys you've had the support of your community to pass GO bonds and do those kinds of things. It doesn't mean that all of your school buildings are modern and efficient. It doesn't mean that yet, right? Or you'd have no need for any more. Even worse in Kansas City, they haven't passed a GO bond in 55 years, 1967. And so yes, there are some buildings there that have some need that is incredible. But that is a challenge of a divided community and a divided system. It's a huge challenge. So now
87% that bond passed. Just want to let you know.
Oh, good for woo. Yes, you guys deserve a round for that. And, just think about that. I mean, that's really fabulous because I know you're starting to see some charter growth. You're not at the levels of Kansas City. But the thought of being on the ballot for that very first time in 55 years, it was something Dr. Waddell and I both wanted to do. And so we're both kind of heartbroken that we're not going to get to be a part of that. But getting out on the ballot for the first time in 55 years and getting enough yes votes when 50% of your families are in charter schools and they don't get access to those monies, that's a huge hurdle. So I'm very optimistic. I want to see that happen, but it's not easy. So kudos for you guys. I was thrilled to see that result in the spring. So now we're at $81 million in these administrative, just these few areas of administrative and operational costs, more than Springfield is. So it's It's a trend, right? It's a pattern. You're seeing how easy it is to prove your own inefficiency as a system. This is not anything that I was aware of when I went to Kansas City. I had no idea that this would be what I would find when I started this study. And you can see that change over time where the costs tend to go up more in the charter community per pupil than they do in the Springfield community. And it is about a variety of those choice decisions. So let's just recap all those. We're not going to look at any more of those non-kid related expenses. But by line, you can see here how much more in the Kansas City system we're spending than Springfield, and it's almost $2,600 per pupil on just those things. 88% more administrative and operational costs than Springfield, who's serving the same or more students. That is a lot of money. There's a lot of money not going directly into what supports kids. Again, that's not all a bad thing. It's an awareness. It's an awareness issue. And it is, you know, our communities have chosen this as a path. So we have to expect some inefficiency, but how we manage it, where we manage it, and how we use this data to inform the rest of the state as we continue to have conversations in Jeff City, I think is really important. So let's talk about kids and what's happening in the school buildings for a little bit. And I'm going to be, this surprised me, but I think it's a good conversation. K-12 regular instruction meaning not special education, not supplemental, not our bilingual kids, but K-12 reg ed expense as we coded out in that financial report to DESE. The Kansas City system, just over $5,000 per student. You can see that charters are spending slightly more per pupil here than KCPS in reg ed. Springfield, $4,229. Considering how much more we were spending operationally, administratively, I thought that this would be reversed. I thought, oh, well, they're keeping all this money. They have a lot more money to put into instruction than we do. That's not the case, and it's not been the case historically. So let's unpack that a little bit. What does that mean? How could we be spending more per pupil than Springfield with those high costs? It's got to be about what? We have more, Angie, don't answer. We have more revenue. So we have more revenue. Otherwise, you would not see this happening. Were it not for that, would those operational costs continue to be the primary and instructional expense continue to come in after? There are certain things when you're budgeting, and I'll never forget my first experience at Columbia Public Schools budgeting. Well, actually, my first guest was the president of the teachers union, and I came out of banking. There was no such thing, right? I didn't actually even know that teachers had contracts or that there was a salary schedule. Like, I had to learn a lot when I went in there. I'm like, what? The salary schedule? What are you talking about? The person who's better doesn't make more? Okay, I don't get it. So there's so much to learn, and it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about helping share, because our public does not know what they do not know about operations and finance around public education. Getting inside of it, you just learn so much. But thinking about certain things that you have to do in your budget before you move to that next thing. So I used to always say fixed costs. Really hard to control utility rate hikes. Really hard to control insurance rate hikes. Really hard if you have a bus contract. Are you guys in-house or do you contract? Okay. Those contracts come with annual escalators, 3% probably. So you've got to pay 3% more for transportation, and that's if fuel doesn't go up, right? So there are some things that you've got to find the money for first before you get to go to some of those other conversations. That didn't go very well with my union leader, and we agreed to disagree on that very professionally for 11 years. But that is a burden of central office to figure out. There are some things that it's kind of hard to get to. So this is about the fact that there is more revenue in the Kansas City system than there is in Springfield. And that's for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about just a little bit. Pre-K 12 special education. So here we are to, again, one of those other important and large line items. This slide I love. Kansas City system, $900 per pupil. Springfield, $962 per pupil. So that's not the only thing I want to talk about on this slide. I want to talk about almost $1,200 per pupil for KCPS and $600 for our charter partners. So how could we be spending so much more in the Kansas City system per pupil than our charter counterparts? Why do we spend more? We're serving the higher population, the higher need population. And there's, I believe when I looked at the revenue side, there are only 4 of 19 charter schools who actually hit a cost per pupil to even draw any high needs funds. Only 4 of 19. So that just that revenue line is evidence of where those high needs students tend to sit. So yeah, we're serving a higher need population, and so therefore we have a higher cost. And this isn't per IEP. This is just that same math for consistency's sake, but it tells the story, I think, very, very much. So how does Springfield spend more per pupil than the Kansas City system, considering their demographics? They have had the luxury, I think, of not having some of those overhead costs, so they're probably getting to do some things for their high needs kids that we wish we could in our charter environments. I don't know. I'm not certain. So supplemental instruction on bilingual. Supplemental is that Title I and the free and reduced driven students. These lines, just like special education that we looked at, do have some additional revenue streams behind them, both federally and from the state level, which is important to note. But this one, again, in the Kansas City system, $669 per pupil in 2021, compared to $237 for Springfield, where we know that in our metro areas, we do have a much more diverse community, and we speak so many, I didn't know there were as many languages as we serve in the public education system. I really didn't know that. And again, look at Kansas City Public Schools compared to charters. I believe it's the same conversation that we had about special education, and that these numbers prove that out very, very much to us. And only 5 of 19 charters have any bilingual cost at all. So again, we know where those students tend to be supported, and it is in your primary public school system. All right, last one of these slides. Student activities. So what other experiences are our kids getting? Because we know that retention, grades, and experience are largely tied to that extracurricular opportunity that we're able to give our students in public education. It's so very important. Classroom is key. This is sometimes, my former superintendent in Kansas City would say, it's the only thing that kept him in school. So in the Kansas City system, $4.4 million or $164 per pupil. In the Springfield system, twice as much. Twice as much in the Springfield. So how can we, why are we spending so much less in Kansas City? We've got more schools, so we have more sports teams, right? Why are we spending so much less? I think the answer to that is in the answer to the bottom question. What typically funds student activity? Angie? No answer from you. What typically funds student activity? Gets a little budget, right? We have budget for coaches and for transportation for kids and for clubs. Parents, fundraising, parent engagement, community engagement. I believe we see a difference proven out here between what's happening in Springfield and what's happening in Kansas City in that arena. I don't know if 50% of their funding is coming from fundraising, but I can tell you when I was in Columbia, there was a lot of money raised. Like there was an event at Hickman High School every year that was $1 million night. There was an event at Rockbridge High School every year that was a $2 million night because they had a more affluent community there. But parents and community engagement can bring a lot of money in for additional opportunities for kids around activities. And so what we tend to see in the charter environment is we've spread those parents out so much, and we're not getting that kind of engagement and support for our kids. We know that I have to remember that I work for Missouri School Boards and I don't work for Kansas City Public Schools. Kansas City Public Schools knows that this is an area that's really important long-term to make sure kids have opportunity, and finding a way to fund it is pretty important. All right. So when we look at those instructional and activity sides, like we did the operational administrative side, we see some mores and lesses, right? Kansas City is spending more per pupil on K-12 instruction, but less on special education. More on supplemental and less on student activities. But again, almost $1,000 more per pupil is being spent in this area in the Kansas City system. So a little of that goes to revenue. It does have to be about revenue because we know we're spending more. That's not to say that we have all the revenue we need, but thank goodness there are revenue sources. But I want to look at that and talk about that a little bit and say, what do these things tell us? And I'm an old accountant slash banker. That's just who I am. So these are my opinions and my thoughts as an accountant slash banker. Coming in from the business sector, and my husband and I have owned small business, to tell you what I see in these numbers. These will mean more. I probably should have done these slides in a little bit of different order. These may mean more when we look at fund balance, but look at that investment income line. Now it's not nearly what it used to be. When I first came into public ed, I'm like, we can fund 20 teachers a year off of our investment earnings. That is fabulous, right? Woo woo. That dipped a lot in recent years. But when we look at 2021, Kansas City Public Schools had $2.7 million in investment earnings. And that's about the fact that we're actively daily monitoring balances, investing funds and placing monies and matching maturities with need and really being proactive about where our money is and how can we maximize it within the very restrictive limits of the state of Missouri. Charter schools, $267,000. They're spending as much money as we are almost, but they're earning 10% in investment yield. That goes directly back to the conversation about that we have to have these really high fund balances to get through the year, and they don't have to because they're getting their money in 12 equal installments. So they can live on really small fund balance where we cannot. So I'm not saying this is a pro or a con, it's just a fact and information. So 3 million in the Kansas City system compared to 2.2. That's about what I would expect. But let's talk about that gifts line. And we know, good for them, that our charter counterparts have the opportunity and have had the need, I would say, in their startup years in particular, to go out and get other means of support. It does. I want you to think about that in relation to the new revenue funding bill. Does give them a huge advantage. That's a revenue stream that we tend not to have in the public school system at the same level because we don't have $1 million donors. We don't have those kinds of friends coming in. So that is a huge additional opportunity for our charter counterparts. And you see that compared to Springfield, it really tells that story, I think. Most miscellaneous local, my opinion is there's nothing miscellaneous about $15 million. That is the old accountant in me. But the DESE advice to our charter schools when Kansas City Public Schools went into voluntary MOUs, which many of you are familiar with, a few years ago when our charters got to that point where there wasn't enough state aid for the state to pass them all that they were owed, we voluntarily entered into agreements with them to meet what the state calculation said they were owed. We're not obligated to do that. That was a decision of our board and our superintendent to do what was right for the families who had made those choices in our community. But DESE told them to put that in that line. So that $15 million is roughly the amount of money that KCPS voluntarily passed to charter schools in order to honor the current state formula at the time. And then you can see Springfield considerably less. I want to take you down to that bottom note. Because if I had used the 1920 data, that 15 million that charters got would have been 35 million because they were eligible for the PPP loans. The public schools are not because they're 501c3s. And so they were able to get those payroll protection loans that public schools could not. And you're going to see what that meant to their fund balances in just a minute. So I would challenge that revenue has not been as big an issue necessarily with our charter counterparts in certain schools. Some of them have no donations in their lines and have small numbers here, but there are some schools that have done quite well on other miscellaneous revenue streams. So fund balance. June 30 of 21, KCPS had $79.6 million. That is a lot of money in fund balance. It's a 33% reserve, but remember, we're paying the bills till January on that fund balance, right? Our charter counterparts had $85 million. So there were more in charter coffers at that point. But look at that compared to just 5 years sooner. I chose to narrow this window on purpose. We went up a little bit in Kansas City, and that's post-COVID where you didn't have as many expenses and ESSER dollars were starting to flow in. Everybody's fund balance has gone up during this time period. Charters have doubled their fund balance during this time period. 44% reserves on average. Springfield, 22% at $66 million, kind of right where I would expect them to be. So in Kansas City, we're sitting on $76 million more in the bank on June 30th than Springfield for the same population. I believe that a CFO's job includes providing advice to the superintendent for the board that is about being conservative, but it is not our job to sit on cash that could be used for kids. That's not our job. It's our job to make sure we're sitting on the appropriate cash to pay the bills so the payroll's never late and those kinds of things. But it bothers me that there's $76 million more in the bank in Kansas City for the same number of kids on June 30th than there is. Because if we were one system, that's a lot of money that would be actively being used in the school district. So it's just a reality of our choice environment. So we know that this last year legislation was passed finally after a lot of years of real trial and tribulation around equity funding in Missouri. Roughly $1,900 on average more that charters are going to get from the state for the most part, a little bit from us, a little bit from the state. But I want to talk about what we think charters will do with this fund and what this previous data we looked at tells us about that. So charters have been gaining enrollment in Kansas City. They've been gaining in revenues, and they've had, like everyone else, these CARES Act additional dollars, unlike us, these PPL dollars, so that they have additional money. But these are areas inside our study, because we look at so many more lines than I've given you, because I wanted to try to stick to an hour, which I'm almost going to make. These are areas where charters have been underspending KCPS. So they were spending less on instruction. And truthfully, when you look at it, they are spending less on certified salaries. While they have the flexibility, and we know the stories about that they do go have the ability to not work on a single salary schedule, and they can call on a middle school math teacher who's amazing in November and say, I'll pay you $10,000 more and pay your buyout clause. They can do that. The data says they aren't doing that system wide, that their teachers are not making what our teachers are making. Media library services, I've heard them speak in Jeff City a lot about if we had more money, we could provide school nurses. That's not something we've been able to do. If we had more money, we could provide social work. If we had more money, we could provide more guidance and counseling. So I think one of the things we need to think about is what are they going to do to up their game with this additional $1,900 per pupil? And how is it going to put us when it comes to that competitive edge? It's going to be tough. It's going to make the job harder if they do a good job investing these additional resources. I don't know that it means they're going to go after those special education students or those bilingual students. I don't know that there's enough revenue there for them to actively reach out to the higher need, higher cost kids. But there is an opportunity for them to up their game in services and compensation and some things like that and become even a better competitor with us. So what do we do now? We made it almost to the end. Will this funding, will we see an expansion in special education and bilingual enrollments? Will the charters who haven't been providing transportation begin providing it because they've got $1,900 more per student now and they think that will bolster their enrollment? Perhaps. So again, to the question of what do we think is going to happen? This year and next year are really going to tell us what those leaders thought were most important and where those monies are invested. So I'm excited to continue this study. So 2 years from now, we have the answer to that. So final slide. What needs to happen from here? I believe we need to understand the impact of charter authorization in St. Louis and Kansas City, and frankly, across the state, as we see that push. And by we, I mean the state of Missouri. I've been doing a lot of talking. I mean our communities and our families and our legislators and our business owners. We need to understand this because this is a business. I always say that we don't look at education as a business, but it's a big business. And I don't care which community you're in, whether you're in my town of 2,800 people, where I'll be moving back to in 3 months, or whether you're in Columbia or St. Louis. Odds are your school district is one of the largest, if not the largest business in your community. And so we have to look at ourselves as that. I believe we do need to ask DESE and our legislators to conduct impact analysis. And that's something at MSBA that we want to be a part of and we want to work on. We want to work on it with you and with Kansas City Public Schools. But before the Missouri system is replicated, we need to know that it works. We need to know that it's sustainable. We need to know that it's really doing good things for kids. We should require that before more approvals happen. Again, we're starting as we collaborate with charter schools in Kansas City. My experience, and this is just my observation, a little bit of a divide from the big charters to our smaller charters, because they are starting to kind of eat their own with expansions, right? And it's harder and harder to be a neighborhood boutique charter than it used to be because of competition. And then we do need to understand best practice. This Annenberg study is one I encourage you to look at and just read. If you have insomnia, it is the key. So after a Red Bull is probably the best time to do it if you do that. But then I also think we need to continue engaging legislation on equity funding, because we did pass it, but was it really equitable based on who we're serving? And I'm going to close with my theory on that. If we were one system, because we are one community, the way we fund our schools, not every school building gets the same amount per pupil. Not every school building has the same class size, because we fund our schools based on who's in them and what they need. So if I'm serving a school, if I'm budgeting for a school building that has a high need population, they're going to have a smaller class size. They're going to have more teachers, they're going to have more specialists, they're going to have more interventionists, and they're going to have more supports than my school on the other side of town, who does not have that same population. We can't do that in our charter communities, because our charter counterparts are getting the same amount per pupil regardless of who they're serving now. So I think we need to continue evolving that conversation. Again, I am grateful that something passed and we were able to not worry about how it was going to treat us, but I think it can be better. And we all need to be a big part of what that looks like. So I've taken a full hour. Happy to take questions, feedback. I will end with an offer. Ms. Tilley and I talked about this on the way up here. I would like to offer to replicate this study that we did in St. Louis for St. Louis and the St. Louis charters. So we have the same data, financial data in the same format, if that's something that your board and your leadership is interested in. The key to that and its value is in also overlaying that data component that I am not the expert in. I am not a student data person, but I think those two side by side really do tell a story that's important. Yes, sir.
Linda, did you, I know in your doing your research for Kansas City, did you take a lot of it though from DESE's website on the ASBR?
All of it.
Because I mean, that's what I
All of
did
it.
last year when we gave our testimony to the Senate committee. We went straight to their website, compared what we're spending versus charters, how we made the differences,
Yep.
you know, special needs, what have you.
Yep.
And it was very, you know.
It tells the story.
It was a wake up call to a lot of senators.
Yeah.
And I know that there is talk among some senators, because we had these discussions privately before 1552 passed, that we're going to look at this on students and their needs and how the charters are going to use this additional money. And if they don't use it the right way and use it in the classroom, then there could be repercussions.
Yes, that's exactly. Everything here has come from DESI's website, most from them from the ASBR.
Yeah, I was surprised at how much information you get on the ASBR web.
Nothing like a good financial report, Steve.
Yeah, no, it was amazing.
Questions for Linda or discussions?
So first and foremost, thank you very much. I think you did an excellent job in terms of the details around finances. Obviously in working with Dr. Medell and yourself in 2019-20, we replicated a similar type of analysis for the St. Louis
Great.
Public School District that is much more exhaustive in terms of buildings and data and all
Awesome.
of that kind of stuff. My question to you is, as you prepared this particular report, were you able to discern anything that's not included here that might be beneficial to a district like ourselves or Kansas City? Obviously, it didn't rise to that same level
Right.
in terms of being included here. So the bottom line is there anything that's not included here that you would have included?
If we had all day and you wouldn't like the eyes roll through the back of your head when I threw my spreadsheets up, it would be what I would do. I did that for Brant Shields and Janet Tilley. But yes, to answer your question, there are so many more lines that told us a lot. Again, not just about the charter system, but just about us at KCPS. And so I think many of those were looking at revenues, who's drawing what kind of revenue, which indicates what services they're not offering. What I learned is that in the 5 years or 6, 7 years now of data that we have, because we've got the historical history built into the one we have. And I think that history is important. That trend information is so important. You can't just look at any one year. You really do need some trend information. Charters have gotten really better about either billing for or providing and billing for Medicaid services. I've seen their Medicaid revenue go up significantly. I was happy to see that. I want to make sure students are receiving that service and that's revenue that they should be claiming. So that was a surprise to me, but we did find for KCPS a few specific expenditure lines where we felt we were kind of out of whack with Springfield, and it gave us an opportunity to dig in and do some more study at the central office level around staffing levels and compensation levels and some things like that. So because you do it by every single line, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank you personally, Linda. I've worked with Linda very closely over the last couple of years, in particular with this specific data. And yes, there is lots more information, and I'm so glad that now you are another resource at MSBA, such that I can contact you.
Yes, please.
Because oftentimes with all of this data, as fascinating as it can be to geeks like us,
right,
you just run out of time.
Right.
So thank you so much.
And I think it has been great working with Angie. First of all, she taught me some things because she spent a lot more time doing this charter side than I have. And it was really great to understand how very different even St. Louis and Kansas City are. Your rules under DSEG very different than our rules under DSEG. I mean, markedly different, right? Completely, sometimes put us on opposite side of the room on things. But one of the reasons that we think this is a project for MSBA to own is because a lot of times it is better coming from a third party than directly from us as districts. Because I've watched Dr. Adams and other superintendents. I tried to keep Dr. Bedell out of Jeff City for this very reason, just get pummeled because they're the superintendent and they've bothered to come speak in Jeff City about their school district. And so sometimes our critical data, it's data. Anybody can check it. Anybody can go pull it. Facts are facts. And if you use facts, sometimes they don't work in your favor and sometimes they do. But sometimes coming from a third party, not that we're always highly regarded either, but sometimes just a third party position and piece of information can be really valuable. So yeah, I love to work with you, Angie, more and more on it.
I want to thank Janet real quick because Janet brought this to my attention, and I'm glad to say she didn't oversell it. And believe me, she spoke very, very highly about this. So I want to thank you. I hope that we can use our data to put it in this sort of format, because the way that you frame it as inefficiencies, we've been talking a lot when we're talking to our local officials about tax abatements and incentives, and trying to sort of reframe the conversation of not just saying, being there, oh no, we're against them,
Right,
but to talk about the opportunity costs.
right.
So we've got to find a balance. And I think that's the same way to look at this. It's kind of a light bulb. I mean,
Right.
we've done this in various instances, but not only to talk to our legislature, but to talk to our own community,
Mhm.
because people don't understand what you're talking about when we're doing this, and the opportunity costs of having all of these buildings, all of these administrators, all of this duplication of services, and it really affects every kid, whatever school you're in.
Right.
And that's, we've been making that point, but this was just a beautiful representation of that.
And I think using it locally, raising taxes is not anything that we all, number one, none of us signed up that was something we wanted to do in life, right? And so any opportunity that we have to be better before we ask, and we can prove we studied, we did what we could, we made ourselves better, should help our communities support us when we need to make the asks, right? And so it really is on us as leaders to do that work. And I acknowledge and appreciate what you guys have been doing. We watched it in Kansas. Let's see how they do that. Because it can't be easy to have a lot of the conversations you've had. But at the end of the day, even if our revenues just stay the same, look what's in it for kids. There's a lot.
I want to thank you on behalf of the union. And just as you said, looking at tax abatements and TIFs, I think last year was about $20 million the St. Louis Public Schools did not get in various tax schemes. And we're not saying there should be no TIFs and tax abatements.
Right.
We're just saying everybody should pay their fair share. I pay my taxes. My assessment went up this year. That means I'm paying somebody else's fair share. And the district and our children shouldn't have to suffer in any way to find a good, fair play ground for us to talk about. And that was on us locally in a legislative sense. But that's an issue. Of course, those other things that are out there, I just took a moment to look at the homeless rate in Springfield and the homicide rate in Springfield and Kansas City and St. Louis. Some of us might, and I don't mean this to be offensive, but it's not a business. We have to
I
think in
understand
the
that.
big picture holistically. And those things all come into it. And so they're going to be extra cost to provide that.
Absolutely.
And when we look at things like how many folks we have working downtown, we don't have enough right now. That's my opinion, but that may seem inefficient, but we need to pay people better and recruit some more people downtown. Those are just some thoughts, and we don't have
Appreciate that.
time to dig into that too much, but I really do appreciate your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've been excited to do this for you guys. And when Janet called and said, what do you think? I said, absolutely. And so please reach out and let us know how we can help and work together more and more on this for you.
Mr. Burton, yeah, there's some more questions, I think. Just turn your microphone on, Mr. Burton. Thank you.
Yep, I would just be remiss if I didn't say thank you for telling this really great story. I'm pretty clear personally about what I think the greatest story ever told is, but this is pretty high up on the list.
Oh, well,
This
thank
is a really
you.
well told story. Using data to do it was awesome. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned in here a recommendation around an impact analysis for charter schools, and we've talked about, in addition to an impact analysis, a feasibility study for new charter schools as well. Do you know of places that are doing that, or does Kansas City have plans to do that?
The Kansas City hope is that the legislature sees that this is critical. So we don't have plans in place to do it. I know you guys have done a little city work. I've been really excited to kind of watch that. But I believe that it's really critical we get this soon at the state level because of that push for expansion. And again, I'm not opposed to charters. And if Columbia, where I was, wants charter schools, if their community wants charter schools, then parents should have what they want. Let's just make sure they're implementing a system that is effective and good for kids and good for the community that it's going into. But to answer that question, no, but I know some people who know some people who are doing it. And so I will do a little work on that and share that with you.
Thank you. And my second question is, as we think about the state funding formula, one of the, you've mentioned a lot of pieces around how the demographics are different. But one of the things that we talk about a lot here is mobility.
Yes.
And
Oh, huge.
homelessness. And so I wonder if you could speak to that. I didn't see that in the presentation.
That was a component that our data team really worked heavy on, and we were able to see the mobility within our system and the mobility in and out of our system. And we did have, that data is hard to get to compare to others because it's not reported to DESE. So you're accumulating it from some other source. Mostly your internal data as much as you can get. It was hard to get some of that mobility around charter schools, but what we know in public ed is that post that September count day, we probably see an influx of students. I like to tell this story. And again, I am not anti-charter schools. I'm just telling you what I've seen in my experience. But my experience in Columbia was very consistent. Every year, the January count was less than the September count because of early graduations. It was always at the high school. Get my January counts my first year at Kansas City Public Schools, and it is more than the September count. As well, you all have done something wrong. You need to redo that. So they had to educate me on that is the trend, that is the reality, and that is what happens. We know in November, right after some sports season, high school boys, particularly boys of color, enrollment goes up at Kansas City Public Schools. It's a fact. And so that mobility piece is huge. It was a great part of the Kansas City data side that was gathered, and that would be a piece that I would love to connect you with Kansas City on, so that I know you've had the opportunity to see a little bit of it, but I would love to connect you with those people to talk about how they gathered and what they saw. But I didn't have anything from DESE that I could use, so therefore it's not up here.
I think we see that just before map testing as well.
Right.
So Dr. Pollack, your two questions are excellent segues into our next item on the agenda, which is just sort of briefly to sort of set what the expectations will be for the upcoming meetings now that we're kind of getting back into the swing of things. As you may remember, so last year, one of the priorities that we did for this committee is to sort of review and discuss not only the legislative platform that we would present to the Board of Education to approve, but also 3 legislative priorities that we'll focus on. And those are all available still on the website from last year. As you remember, in terms of the priorities, we had 3. One was regarding 1552. So I think that one needs to change, even though there's still work to be done around 1552, as Linda said, and we've been in discussions with people. I've been in discussions with Kansas City. Now that we're all on the same page, how do we go and work together on that piece? The other 2 were around trauma and homelessness. I mean, my suggestion would be we keep that because we've solved neither one. We just sort of scratched the surface, and there's a lot of more work to be done on that. And then, so I would ask before our next meeting, because we generally approve these, I think, October, November. So we have the documents and everything ready to be sent out to our legislators that will work towards working on that at our next meeting, which will be October 20th. But in terms of mobility, we arranged for a presentation on mobility. And Dr. Williams, you can speak a little more about the work of that group briefly. So we've asked that group to present to us in October. Since you're on that committee, if you could just sort of,
Absolutely.
I don't even remember, I don't even know what the name or the acronym is. So, because it's a lot of letters.
So let me just.
And I'm completely putting her on the spot, by the way.
That's okay. So thank you, Linda. An excellent job. And thank you for kind of framing some of the challenges and opportunities and implications for the work. So to Mr. Davis's point, October 20th? October 20th will be our next legislative committee meeting. And during that meeting, we'll have an opportunity to kind of frame some of the work around the data specific to mobility across the city of St. Louis, and really looking at a high level overview of what's happening when we talk about mobility patterns. And to the point that was brought up earlier, using specifically DESI data to understand what's happening from a quantitative perspective. I think the work of the SRPC is really focused on centering the voices of practitioners. So this is a study that is part of the work that's happening across our district and across the city, looking at how does mobility impact student learning? How does mobility impact the ways that we look at the development of school communities, and certainly how we serve each and every member of our school district and our city residents. So the mobility study will provide us with an opportunity to really delve into quantitative information specific to the city and what's happening in patterns. And so I think the researchers that are involved in this, Washington University, is 4 universities, Washington University, St. Louis University, Harris Stowe, and University of, who am I missing? St. Louis University, Harris Stowe, WashU, and University of Missouri. And so just really understanding from both a practitioner's perspective and a research agenda to really understand patterns of mobility and the impact on our school district in ways that can help us lift up the voices of our students, our parents, and the community that we serve. Questions or concerns, comments? So we are looking forward to having an opportunity to share very specific data, high-level data, and to understand and unpack what it means as we have discourse around this very important work. Mobility is a challenge in our city, and certainly we know that understanding and making sense of those patterns will help us make better decisions about the work that we are engaged in. The one piece I do want to share, and I think it's important just to note, as we look at quantitative information, it's critically important to understand the qualitative data. And so the data sets that we share on the 20th of October will specifically take into account the DESI data that's available. It's public data. However, the qualitative piece, the why behind the numbers and the narrative that is framed as a result of that's an area that we're still unpacking. So I want to make sure that we are very intentional about what we can expect to see and hear as part of that presentation. I hope that's helpful.
No, I think it is helpful. And just to sort of add on to it, the purpose of this committee is to propose legislation and also to advocate for the issues that affect our district. So just as, Linda's presentation, I would hope is going to help us lead to accomplishing a couple of those bullet points. And not to put my thumb on the scale, but I think perhaps one of our legislative priorities should be to advocate and for legislation requiring those impact analysis studies before there's any new schools or expansion of schools in the city of St. Louis, which would really actually be sort of a practical aspect to our moratorium, which we've already received support for citywide. I also think that looking at the data, and I'm kind of pushing this group to, come and start talking to us before they, they're researchers, so they want to have everything done. But I'm very anxious to just start educating ourselves as well as educating the community. And so I'm going to invite, again, like we did previously, practitioners from the city, from other groups around housing security to start and listen with us about this data, and particularly focus, when we look at the problems citywide, focus on first how it affects students, because we're not getting anywhere otherwise. And so I think that we have a responsibility, as we talked about last year. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know because we all worked on this together. But if we're going to gather this data and we have it, we got to do something with it. And if we've got to take it and start hitting people over the head with it until they start to act right, that's our obligation. So that's what I think we should do again this year. So any other thoughts or questions or concerns?
I just want to take this opportunity because I know there's some people out watching this out in the community to say thank you to the people of St. Louis. 87%. I'm honored to have served as treasurer for Proposition S. Thank you sincerely.
Yes, and thank you, Byron. And I know everybody at this table, well, maybe not Steve, but he was rooting for us. Worked very hard on that, for sure. So yes, thank you. So if there's nothing else, we can adjourn.
Like to make a motion to adjourn?